lovely to see you all again. I'm just going to do a sort of, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, light-hearted canter through some statistics. If you want them, do email ben.page@ipsos.com and you can do whatever you like with them. It will be death by PowerPoint, but at least you'll be able to look at them at your leisure if you want them later. Because I think, we are in an interesting time. Last year, Brexit, Donald Trump was supposed to be the year that, was unexpected, and now this year, things continue to surprise us. And all over the world, I think, what we can see when we talk to people, 23,000 people across the globe monthly, and you can see this sort of sense of uncertainty, a sense that the world is becoming more dangerous, more unpredictable, a lot of which is actually untrue, but it's how people are feeling, and that plays out in our politics. So if we look at Britain to start with, this is the list of things that every month when we ask people without prompting, what's the thing keeping you awake at night? It's now Brexit, obviously, the NHS, immigration, housing a long way down the list. Of course, the European Union wasn't even on that list, wouldn't even make that list until the beginning of 2016. It's entirely something that our political classes have decided is fascinating and interesting, and now it is interesting to the public. And of course, the National Health Service, the closest thing we have to a religion, and I want to talk a little bit about that because, of course, its relationship with you and social care is so important. We are also an interesting place that any student of statistics back in the 1970s, 80s or 90s would have thought was unbelievable, in a sense that we have record employment in this country. The scourge of my childhood in the 1970s and when I was at university in the 1980s was unemployment. Unemployment now is a long way down people's lists of worries. We have record low interest rates, and yet we also have record anxiety about poverty and inequality in this country. And that is, of course, because the problem now is not unemployment, but it is in-work poverty. And that is, of course, something that we can see on a daily basis in our city. Homelessness in Britain has doubled since 2010. The number of rough sleepers you see in all of our cities has also doubled. I've been in Birmingham, in Cardiff. This is not the mark of a country that we will all feel comfortable with. So some real challenges. It's not top of the list of priorities, but it's very marked, this transition. And this is people, without being asked, saying that this is an anxiety of theirs. And of course, as the election showed, Britain is getting tired of austerity. In 2010, we had the majority of the population, 59%, saying cuts were necessary to public services in order to pay off the very high national debt we now have. Our national debt has increased since 2010, but the proportion who now believe that we must make cuts to public services to pay it off has fallen to 22%. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will be willing to pay a lot more taxes, although we'll come on to that, because I think there are some options for the Chancellor next week, which he probably won't take, but there are some. But it's certainly true that we're getting tired of austerity in this country. And also, of course, we are starting to see, I think, and you can see this in the prison service very dramatically, the impact of a word which economists use all the time, hysteresis. And that means the long-term cumulative effects of changes. And that, of course, is now, you can do things for a year or two. It's a bit like unemployment. The first 3 months are like a holiday. The next 6 months get a bit more worrying. Then a year later, you spend all your savings, and then you can't buy any more cutlery or stuff when you break things. And so things take time to play through the system. So we're getting tired about austerity. What should we protect? And here is part of the challenge, and again, one of the risks for this sector next week. The NHS and education at the top of the list. Social care is up there. But of course, local authority services, well, what are those? Don't know what they do. What's local government? As usual, what's local government ever done for me? So let's take a bit more. 63%, they've seemed to manage quite well. I've just retweeted something about the 63% reduction in spend over the decade. And of course, one wag on Twitter immediately said, well, this showed they were massively overfunded before, because they're managing all right, aren't they? I said, maybe go and ask some social care users or non-users. So some real challenges, but the NHS is absolutely at the people's top of the list, and how we work with the NHS is hugely important. I have, in the last couple of years, nursed my stepfather and my mother to their decline at home in London. It was really hard, even though they had enough money, to find social care. to look after them at home. Death, when the NHS finally stepped in, was wonderful. The palliative care for the last few weeks was brilliantly organised by Guy's and St Thomas's. But the getting there and trying to find out about it, and if, in theory I should be able to, was much more difficult. So some real challenges. And, you know, if we're looking at austerity, I'm worried that the government is going to do too little to help people in the years ahead. In 2010, 50% said they were concerned about that. It's now 69%. So you can see that public opinion is moving. And this one is a slightly busy chart, but look at the yellow line at the top. Government services should be extended, even if it means some increases to taxes. It went down and down and down from 1997 to 2009, but then since then it started rising. And in August of this year, it was at 63%. Now, I'm always wary about questions like that, because when people say services should be extended if it means tax rises, they often mean other people's tax rises. And of course, one of the things that we've done is take a very large proportion of the population out of taxation altogether, which again has positive and negative aspects. But certainly you can see that the mood is changing. And perhaps more tellingly, here we tried for the King's Fund, would you personally pay more tax for the NHS? 66% say they would. It's regularly at the top of people's lists of priorities. It seems to me that the government has a moment to whack another 1% on national insurance, or 1p on national insurance, to help pay for this. And it worked for Tony Blair at the beginning of the century. I think it's probably time to do it again. Whether we will see this next week, I doubt, but certainly there is plenty of top cover if you believe the headlines from the polls. And of course, our politics is changing in other ways, and one of them is something quite marked. Could you put up your hands in this if you were born before 1970, please? Okay, so we're really old. It's lovely to see you all. And what has happened, and of course you won't also necessarily all recognise yourselves in this next chart, but what has happened in Britain is that we have become a country divided not so much by class, although it still matters, but increasingly a country divided by age. If you're under 44, you have voted Labour in the general election outside London, because London is special. As Stephanie Flanders of the BBC puts it, London is a great city attached to a crap country. She said it, not me. But you can see, as the older you get, the more conservative you become. Now, the challenge for the Conservatives, and it was very interesting at the party conferences, I don't know how you felt for those of you who attended it. I thought the Labour conference, even though Labour lost, was one that had actually won the election, and the Conservative conference was all about having lost the election, how they'd never get anybody under 40 to ever vote for them again. So we are in a sort of quite febrile time, and it's interesting, of course, that the polls since the election are completely becalmed. If you're a Labour supporter, you'll be saying, well, one more push, as John MacDonald told me a few weeks ago, and you know, we will be in power, there will be a trip in the House of Commons, a vote of confidence, and we will be back to spending billions on public services. I still don't think local government is getting enough of that promised money yet, but anyway. And of course, if you're a Conservative, you'll look at the numbers and think, we're in a pretty bad shape, but they're only 1 to 2% ahead of us at the moment, when, of course, in the 1990s, the lead would have been about 20%, and even Ed Miliband managed a 12% lead over the Conservatives. So both sides can sort of look at it and take positives and negatives. But this age difference is hugely important, because while young people are not different in their expectations, I've just looked at Gen Z for the first time. These are people born after 1995. Guess what Gen Z think matters? Family, having a house, having a secure career. Strange, they're just like everybody else. But there are other things where the different young people do trust ordinary people less, whether this is because we've told them endlessly about stranger danger. You know, they are more liberal with a small L, and they're certainly more liberal on matters of sort of homophobia, misogyny, and everything else. So some big differences. In London, of course, when we ask people, as we have done for London councils this October, what are the big issues? A very different picture to the rest of Britain. Top of the list, housing. Top of the list. And then crime is there, transport infrastructure, terrorism, of course, 21% now saying it's important. And the European Union, well, we'll see what happens. But these are the day-to-day issues that concern people. And London is massively different from the rest of the country. And I would absolutely agree with Peter that, you know, unless the state, be it local government or central government through some other vehicle, starts building again or is allowed to start building again, we are not going to fix the crisis. All the market interventions, bribes, cajoling, etc., has not led to the amount of growth that we need in housing supply. And of course, what's been changing over the last 3 years or 4 years that we've been doing this survey? A rising concern about crime, and of course, acid attacks and knife crimes. The editor of the Evening Standard has more fun in his job than it is reasonable for any human being to do, particularly of his constant jibes at Theresa May. But, of course, it also has an effect on how we feel about our city. Even if your chances of being done in are infinitely lower than in the 1970s, the thing that kills more people in the world today than all war, crime, and terror put together is mental health. Suicide. That's what kills more human beings than anything that goes on, but we're getting more worried about crime. Transport actually is receding as an issue. Terrorism, 1% in 2015, 21% this time. We've seen a string of attacks, and it's taken, I mean, the sad thing is it's now taken as a sort of matter of course that something happened today. Oh well, it happened today. There we are. Public services creeping up a bit, the environment, and of course nobody was mentioning the European Union at all before, but one person in 10 now does. And of course many of those people who are people like the 300 of the 1,000 people who work for me who come from the European Union and want to know what's going to happen to them. But housing is the issue. And the challenge we face in London is that people in London want to own their own home. Mrs. May talked about the British dream, but actually there are things that unite Britons, even though we might be split on many issues. One is the idea that one wants to own one's own home. In London it's the same. Whether you're a social renter, a private renter, or an owner-occupier, your preferred choice is to own your own home. When we say to renters, if I told you you were never going to own your own home and you were going to rent for the rest of your life, would you be happy or unhappy? 13% say they'd be happy, 67% say they would be unhappy if they knew they would never own a home. It really doesn't matter whether you're looking at people working full-time, not working full-time. The aspiration is ownership. Now, it may change. Before the Second World War, this was not the most common tenure, but people's expectations are conditioned by what they see around them, but that is the expectation. And if you don't get it, what will you do? Well, maybe I'll move to Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds or somewhere else. Now, I think that's probably overstated, but certainly we can start to see young graduates just saying, look, I was talking to somebody who was applying for a job with us but has decided to take a job in Leicester instead. The salary I was offering was £3,000 a year more in Leicester than in Leicester. After the time she'd worked out the housing costs and everything else, Leicester was a far better bet for her. And that is the challenge that we face. And interestingly, if you look at the British Social Attitudes Survey, this is a national survey, the proportion of people who say they support more homes being built in their area has doubled over the last few years. Now, of course, I'm not a local politician or a planner trying to get something through in a leafy part of outer London, but nevertheless, we can see that something, again, as with austerity, seems to be changing. And then who's going to do it? Housing associations and local government. That is the people who are going to be most effective at dealing with the housing crisis. So, whatever we say about local government, and we'll come to that in a minute, as we know, more people trust local councillors than trust national politicians. That's always been the case since Ipsos MORI first started asking questions about it in the 1980s. It will never change. Private landlords, well, no. So, absolutely clear that the solution lies in the public sector, and the question is whether or not that would be recognised by the government. In London at the moment, when we've asked how you're managing, we've got about 18% of people who say that they're not doing well. Obviously, most people sort of getting by. 16% say they're doing very well. So not huge problems, quite frankly, despite the fact, as Catherine said earlier, that when you look at Londoners' spontaneous concerns compared to the rest of Britain, we are more likely to mention housing. We are more likely to mention poverty. We are more likely to mention worklessness. And we have, of course, that arc of poverty that we're still trying to deal with. But when people look to the future, that anxiety rises. Are you worried about being made redundant or becoming unemployed? A quarter. Falling behind on your mortgage or rent. Another quarter. So some significant anxiety there in the background. And of course, we will all know people in London earning much, much more than the average household income of Britain of around 27,000, who really feel they cannot cope in London with the money that they're on. A vibrant job market. Would you be able to get a job in the next 12 months if you lost it? Everybody says yes, but I'm rather worried about this at the age of 53, because 55 to 64-year-olds, only 40, it goes down from, the people say it's not going to be good, go from 14 to 37. And you know, when you ask people, what's going to stop you getting a job? Well, I'm just too old. Not enough jobs in my industry is going through disruption, or it's changing, bad job market generally, etc. But this ageism is an issue, and we need to shape up to this as a society. I mean, this is true in London, but of course it's true in the country as a whole. The Office of National Statistics, when they have a few drinks at Christmas and start doing long-range forecasts, predict that by the beginning of the next century there will be 1 million people over 100 in this country. 1 million. And for all of us who are getting on a bit in life, I have some good news, and that is that generally older people are happier than middle-aged people. And just a tip, but this is all about how we deal with it. If you're positive about your old age, on average, you will live 7.5 years longer, irrespective of your health or your wealth, than if you're negative about the effects of aging. So a positive mental attitude matters, but so does age discrimination. And that may be the next thing that we need to think about along with gender. Terrorism, of course, as we've seen, a concern about terrorism is up. And we've had a series of outrages in the city, each somehow becoming almost predictable. I think what's really encouraging, though, is when you ask people, do you think this is a place where people get on well together? That's actually, if anything, strengthened. Social rent is up 15%, 3/4 of them saying that's true. Owner-occupiers 84%, inner London 77%, it's gone up. Outer London 85%, it's gone up as well. 42% of people definitely agree that we get on. London mucks together well. And of course, when we ask Londoners in this city about what are the great things about London, one of the first things they mention is the mixture of people here. That is what makes this one of the greatest cities on earth. And that's why people from all over Britain, all over Europe, and all over the world still want to live here. And it's one of the reasons why when we ask 23,000 people around the world which city they would most like to live in, they would most like to visit, or they think that would be a good place to live, London is regularly in the top 3, along with places like New York and Sydney. So, and no change yet from Brexit. And indeed, Britain's reputation has only slipped so far a little bit with Brexit in our global work for the British Council. Now, when we look at local government as a whole, overall, do we think you're going to make the right decisions? 54% say local councils are the right people to make the right decisions. GLA got very, very low recognition, does a bit better than central government, which is sort of drifting down. So local government, seen as obviously the people to make decisions about local areas. There has been a small decline amongst social renters. I mean, it's only 3 points lower than in 2015. And of course, interestingly, in the national polling that the Local Government Association does, there has been a small decline as well over the last couple of years. But given the fact that council tax is rising, and the services provided to the average person who is not a recipient of social care, which is of course more and more rationed, are in decline, is it any surprise? Perceptions of value for money have fallen by about 10 percentage points since 2010. Again, I'm not really surprised, given that the money people pay in. One of the reasons they love the NHS so much is they sort of understand what it does, and it never sends them a bill. Slightly different with local government. And on devolution, do you support, don't worry with all of that text, do you support transferring more powers to London? Yes. 6 out of 10 Londoners say so. Very similar, pretty rock-solid numbers, 14% opposed. The only challenge on this is that when we ask people, okay, and would you like them to have complete freedom to work out how to tax you? They become a bit more anxious about it. So they quite like the idea of local decision-making. I mean, and the other challenge, of course, in this country, and which is one of the reasons why local taxation, devolution, is something that governments love to talk about in opposition and then struggle with, of course, when they're in power, is that the British people generally believe that more decisions should be made locally, and that we're actually one of the highest, the most likely countries on earth to say that when we ask the same question across the planet. But, of course, we also believe that everything should be the same everywhere. We once asked people, would you like the government to guarantee the length of grass in Britain's parks, in every park, to make sure it was 2 inches everywhere? The public said, yes, please. Recycling? Yes, please. They wanted all the same everywhere. So they can't have both, and that is one of the challenges. Oh, how did I do that? Can you dehibernate the computer? Then I'll try and remember what comes next. If it takes... Talk amongst amongst yourselves. Brilliant. Okay. Public health. Again, this is something you were given, and the public is still not quite sure about how that would work or what you might do. So 44% think it's a good idea. 50% say they don't know, they don't trust you much about it at all. You know, do get some more doctors or buy some doctorates on some internet websites for your counsellors. So they can all call themselves doctor this and doctor that. Immediately their trust ratio will go up, by the way, and it's almost guaranteed. That was a joke, yes, anyway. But I think it's interesting. We asked people what would help you, what should councils do to improve public health? So you can see one thing, 68% are in favour. You've got a majority, 59% here, and actually more people in favour of all of these things, one of which is going to be controversial. So let's have a look. These are things you might do. First of all, get rid of the betting machines, stop chip shops opening and chicken shops opening near schools, ban smoking in public parks, 54% in favour. Good luck with that one. And ban smoking in pub gardens. Well, you know, even Stevens. Converting street parking spaces to electric car points. Now that's interesting because, of course, there are still relatively few electric cars out there, but of course most people, a lot of people in London are not going to be drivers. So, but again, as you all know all too well that the drivers might get quite excited about some of that. But that, of course, is going to gradually change because this is where the government has already decided there will be nothing except hybrid or pure electric vehicles on the roads in the next decades or so. So some pretty clear wins there. Get rid of the betting machines and get rid of the chicken shops near schools. And there's quite clear support for that. So I think, we are in an interesting time. I mean, as Tony Travers has said so eloquently on other occasions, the challenge you face is that because you're just competent and get on with stuff, and people don't really understand what local government does, you're always a good place for central government to go and look for a bit more savings. We've seen it, we see it in other countries as well. When Canada had to do austerity a number of years ago, it was local government that took the pain and not central government. We see this time and time again, but it can't go on forever. Anything that we can do to build that housing, any clever vehicles that will let us do that is hugely important. If we do, please could we build terraced housing? Londoners, in a survey that we did for the Skyline campaign last year, choose that as their most preferred form of tenure. And, if you think of the most densely populated parts of this city, some parts like Kensington, full of those tall, dense terraces that are extremely popular and valuable. The skyscrapers, we've got nearly 500 buildings of over 20 stories now that have planning permission. If we build them all, it will look like Shanghai. Is that not right, David? No? Okay. But there are hundreds that have planning permission. More change is coming, of course. We've got to live with it. But I think the key thing is that London is resilient. And the photo of the guy leaving the scene of the London Bridge attack, trying to balance his beer as he went home, is just, and the data from this survey on people's feelings, the terrorists, as Ken Livingstone said in that very memorable speech after the attack in 2005, will never win, but we do face some challenges. The other thing I'd say is that although British institutions of all kinds, whether it's Parliament, whether it's local government, whether it's the BBC, are under attack, the NHS, actually, when you look at Britain compared to other English-speaking countries like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, or America, or Canada, interestingly, when you ask people what are the best things about this country, in our top 10, it's often state institutions. And one of the reasons why Britain keeps going is because actually we are much more flexible and adaptive. Look at your sector as an example of that. I think what you say, of course, as leaders in your boroughs does actually have a huge impact. People want leadership. We better expect the unexpected. And I'd just say, let's make a difference. London is a brilliant, brilliant city, but we do need to keep calling out some of the easy stereotypes that ministers from other parts of the country might have about it, because it is the goose that laid the golden egg, but at some point hysteresis kicks in even here. The end. Thank you.
Ben, hugely informative and entertaining as ever. We're obviously sort of got a little bit tighter on time, but I'm sure some people will want to ask some questions or make some points. Let's take 2 or 3 at a time, and if we can keep them sort of reasonably quick and keep the pace going, that would be great. So if people would like to indicate if they have something that they'd like to come back to Ben on as a result of all of that. And perhaps my confidence is misplaced, but let's see. I've got a gentleman at the back. Yeah, so... There's a microphone there. If you'd just like to say who you are, Phil. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Phil Wallace. Ben, how important is one's tenancy, whether you're renting, owning or whatever, on your voting intention, and has that changed?
So got that. Just let me just see if there's anyone else to pick up. There's a gentleman there just halfway back.
Councillor Michael Bull from London Borough of Merton. Just wondered, you said that there's a preference for ownership of properties. Is there also, in your research, did you find a potential rejection of shared ownership or a preference towards individual ownership over shared ownership?
Ben, do you want to take those two while
All right, so I'll do them in reverse order. So on the issue about shared ownership or intermediate tenancies and all of this stuff is that tenants just don't know about them. There's up to half of tenants say they've never heard of any of these other options for ownership. So there's a massive selling job to be done on that, quite frankly. I mean, and that's the issue. And if you email me, I can send you the data. There's been a number of studies looking at that. On the connection between tenure and voting, I mean, one of the ironies about the general election was that, of course, this was the general election where the Conservatives had their best ever share of vote amongst working class voters, and the Labour Party had its best ever share of vote amongst middle class voters. So everything is up and down, but yes, social renters, and particularly in London, will tend to be strongly Labour, and I haven't looked at the latest numbers, but my guest, Tony Travers, again, will be much more eloquent on the voting stuff because that's what he's done for you. But look at the numbers in London. London, in the general election of 2015, went against the grain, and Labour gained share in London and lost it elsewhere. And again, of course, London is now this sort of block of red in a large sea of blue. Some of that is a Brexit dynamic, and things like the Kensington result, which I must admit in my life I'd never believed I would see, is in part due to that. But no, yes, tenure does matter, but age matters too. And the challenge for you all in the local elections, of course, is getting the vote out. Young people have come back to voting in the Brexit referendum and in the 2017 election in a way that we haven't seen them since the end of the 1980s. And of course, I had believed it was being stupid, I had believed it was a permanent feature of the British political landscape that the young just didn't vote. That is no longer true. Whether exactly what happens in local elections, of course, is another matter. And I think there is for all of you, a real challenge there for those of you who are interested in young voters and getting them to actually take part.
Thank you. Any more questions or points for Ben? So we've got Robert, and I think it's Tony I can see just at the back. So if you want to go first.
Ben, Robert Gordon-Clark. Have you polled people's opinion on Greenbelt, protecting it, and metropolitan open land, and the correlation between that, the demand for more homes, but also your polls showing people want terraced housing? Yeah. How do you square that circle?
Okay, and we've got, I think, Tony at the back there, I think. Is there a microphone? I think there's a hand up there, you can see. Thank you.
Hi, it's,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Well, I don't know if
you
got me or not. So it's Anne Fairweather, I'm a city councillor. I was just interested in terms of the dynamics around people from different countries and voting, because obviously in London a lot of people are born outside of the UK. A lot of them have the right to vote, and most crucially, a lot of European citizens will be able to exercise that right to vote for the first time since the referendum. Traditionally, they haven't voted a great deal. Do you have any data around nationality and engagement with these issues?
So I'm sorry, Anne, but the short answer is no easy data on that one. I can make some guesses, which are probably as good as yours, about how they might vote if they can. But there is an issue about lower awareness and confusion about eligibility. On the Greenbelt, what's interesting is that overall in Britain as a whole, or in the southeast, people say they've never heard of it, but when you tell them about it, they say it should be protected. They're also very confused about what it is and where it is and what it includes. So it's a bit like the NHS in some ways. It's more of an idea than a reality in some ways. When I talk about terraced housing, to be honest, in both outer and inner London, terraced housing is the preference. And I think that the challenge is, how do we build something that is as attractive as some of the stuff that we have that has outlasted much outlasted the people who built it, and has lasted and is popular for a number of reasons, and we still haven't got there. I'm not an expert on this, but I just think Le Corbusier blocks all over the Greenbelt is probably not the solution. And we need to think about that. But it is less sacred than you think, because a lot of the Greenbelt isn't particularly green or lovely. At the same time, and this is a chat, is anybody here from Havering? The most miserable borough in London. Good to see you. No, but I mean, the interesting thing about there is a lot of outer London that isn't very dense. It is loved by the people who live there. We have lots of 1930s low-rise development that isn't particularly beautiful, but it is loved by the people that are there. And the question is whether we can densify some of those areas in a way that is meaningful to the people who live there, that lets them buy into it. Some suggestions are to let people have the right to build up to 4 stories on their plot and let them take the profit. So there are all sorts of different organisational suggestions. Again, I don't have to try and get this through. I just have to make the observation. But certainly, all I would say is that the way we are going, I think, with tower blocks, while they can be attractive, and I love the Shard, I love the Gherkin, covering London in them is going to be a challenge. And how we deal with multiple tenancies, people not paying their very expensive service charges in years to come if they don't sell or the market goes sideways, I'm not sure we've fully thought that through, because the people who build them don't always plan to be around to be responsible for the outcome, but you will be.
So Twitter has just exploded in Romford, but last two, if we'd like to go. So there's a lady just a couple of rows back in the second group, and then there's a gentleman just here in the front. So we'll take these as the last two. Thank you.
Councillor Anne Hutton, London Borough of Barnet. I just wondered if you had any information about people's attitude to schools and academies and free schools, and whether or not people think that on the whole schools should come under local authority control, or whether they're very happy for schools to be centrally controlled. If you had any information, I don't know.
We have done that.
Okay, and there's a gentleman here.
I am Councillor Jose Alexander from Newham.
Yeah.
I think we have one of the biggest issue in Newham is landlord licensing scheme has been introduced by Mayor of London, Mayor of Newham, and the councillors. And there are bad landlords and good landlords in Newham.
Yeah.
They are exploiting very, very poor people in Newham. So I would like to see all the London boroughs introducing landlord licensing scheme. What is your opinion?
Okay, so that would certainly be popular with people who privately rent, and they are the least happy with their housing out of all types of tenants. So, and absolutely, and so I personally just agree with you on that. On academies, I mean, this is not what we call a high salience issue. The public is not obsessed about whether central government is running education or local government. But if you ask them, they tend to think that local government should be much more involved and have much more control. And they don't quite understand why somebody in Whitehall is the arbiter of all things education. So, that's where we are. And free schools, again, are very divisive in terms of public attitudes. But it's not, as I say, the issues. There are people who feel very, very strongly about that on both sides. For most people, it's not the issue. And of course, we have to remember that while we might be very worried about things like attainment, for parents, until the child is 14, it's about safety.